Order. I would call Sir Ashley Fox to move the motion, and then I would call the Minister to respond. There will not be an opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as the convention is, as this is a 30-minute debate. I do know at least one other member has indicated they wish to speak, and maybe interventions. Sir Ashley Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to move that this House has considered the environmental impact of the proposed salt marshes at Pawlett Hams and other sites. It's an honour to serve with you in the chair, Mr. Twigg, and I'd also like to welcome the Minister to her place. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to move this motion, which is of great importance to my constituents in Bridgwater. I asked for this debate to discuss EDF's plans to establish a salt marsh at Pawlett Hams in Somerset. This proposal was highly unpopular with the local community. In fact, it was difficult to find anyone who thought it was a good idea. When I met with EDF, even they seemed a little half-hearted about it. But why, you might ask, does EDF, who are building the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station a few miles down the coast, want to flood 800 acres of beautiful Somerset countryside and turn it into a salt marsh? The answer is complex. When EDF were given planning permission to build Hinkley Point C, they were required to take measures to mitigate damage to marine life caused by the water intake pipes. These are situated in the Bristol Channel and, as you might imagine, there is a risk of harm to fish that might get sucked into those pipes. EDF originally set out 3 proposals to minimise the risk of harm to marine life. Firstly, by designing special low-velocity, side-entry water intake pipes with a capped head design. This reduces the number of fish that are sucked into the pipe as they swim past the end. Secondly, a fish recovery and return system. This means that a good proportion of the fish who swim into the intake pipe get returned to the sea with minimal injury. Not a perfect system, but certainly one that will save the more resilient species. And thirdly, they were required to install an acoustic fish deterrent, or AFD. This involves the installation of a number of sound projectors placed underwater. These would play a constant loud noise designed to stop fish from approaching the area of the intake pipes. EDF now says it is unable to install the AFD because of engineering difficulties and health and safety risks to divers who would need to maintain the system. In order to deviate from their AFD proposals, EDF are having to submit a material change application. As part of that application, they are working with the Environment Agency to agree several compensatory habitat measures in order to deliver benefit to the estuary's qualifying habitat. Now, EDF say they are putting forward a mosaic of mitigation measures. Some of these seem sensible and beneficial to the natural ecosystem in and around the Severn estuary. For example, the creation of several hectares of seagrass in the estuary and a commitment to delivering 15 hectares of kelp forest. They are also considering upgrades to several weirs to benefit migratory fish. The most significant proposal, though, and the one that brings us to Westminster Hall today, is the creation of 800 acres of salt marsh. There was, at the beginning of this year, a consultation by EDF on this salt marsh being established in Pawlett Hams in my constituency. Pawlett Hams is a precious ecosystem. EDF's plans to flood this area with salt water would endanger not just the land itself, but the myriad of species that call it home. It would transform the biodiverse habitat into barren, species-poor salt marshes and tidal mud. What is most extraordinary about EDF's plans is that the Hams is an area of great ecological importance. It forms part of the Bridgwater Bay site of special scientific interest, which was first declared in 1989. This recognises the area as one of particular interest to science due to the rare species of flora and fauna it contains. There is a lush, biodiverse habitat with many animals in the Hams. This includes lapwings, redshanks, otters, water voles, water beetles, great crested newts and yellow wagtails. These species would be driven out if the area was turned into a salt marsh. The hams provide valuable grazing for local farmers, which would also be lost. In my view, EDF's plan was a disaster. And even if it went ahead, it was not clear how it would mitigate for the fish lost. And I made my views abundantly clear to EDF over the months. So I was delighted when, a day after making this request for a debate, EDF announced they are pausing their proposal. EDF say they are now considering 4 other potential sites for salt marshes in the Severn Estuary at Kingston Seymour, Littleton, Arlingham and Rodley. Yes, happy to give way.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for all your detail there. It was an excellent sort of summary of exactly what they're proposing also in Arlingham. This was put to the people of Arlingham, and they had a large meeting on Monday evening, and almost universally there was a feeling that this wasn't a good idea for people of Arlingham, or indeed for their landscape, and many of the reasons that you have put across are the same in Arlingham. It does seem rather strange to me that as mitigation for this, what they're predicting is about 182 million fish that may be lost, that the Arlingham site and salt marsh is somehow going to compensate for that. And I don't think there's any way that we can say that these two match each other. Yes, certainly. So what I would say is, while I support the principle of habitat creation and acknowledge the benefits of the salt marsh, does the Minister share my concern that EDF's application to modify Hinkley Point C consent order seems like an unacceptably high price for an environmentally unique habitat to pay? Thank you.
Well, I'll leave the Minister to answer those points, if I may. Yes, would I give way?
I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for giving way. I would like to pay tribute, and I'm sure the member will too, to the amazing community at Pawlett Hams, who campaigned ferociously in a quite a gentle way, but very, very single-mindedly to get their aims across and their dislike across. And I hope that, as is reflected in the other gentleman's comments about the community, and indeed the communities that we have a meeting on Monday next week. But it is actually the matter that the communities feel that perhaps EDF and the Environment Agency may have been a little heavy-handed in their first approaches, in that they seem to be rather fierce and not accepting of the fact that people have a view about their own community and the sustainability of it.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and she anticipates the next part of my speech, which is to say that as a new MP, it is tempting to believe that this change of heart by EDF is entirely due to my persuasive powers. But that is not the case. All credit must go to the Pawlett Hams Action Group, a genuine grassroots campaign that sprang up to defend the hams. The group demonstrated the significance of the hams by conducting wildlife surveys and collecting personal and historical testimonies. They also raised awareness of the issue through petitions, social media, community events such as the photography competition and collaboration with local schools. I want to pay tribute to the group's coordinator, Judith Ballard, and to other leading members, Moira Allen, Rachel and Molly Fitton, and Joy Russell. There are many others who worked hard to save the hams, that it might be enjoyed for generations to come. I thank them all. Perhaps they can help my honourable friends in resisting unwanted salt marshes. Now, while my constituents and I welcome EDF's decision not to proceed with this plan, there are several outstanding questions that need answering. My first question relates to the inclusion and now the planned removal of the AFD in the Development Consent Order. This was included at the request of the Environment Agency. I want to know why it was included if, as we are now told, it is unsuitable for the conditions in the Bristol Channel. And related to that question, what was the process between the Environment Agency and EDF on agreeing that it should be removed? The process to my local community looks opaque. Some of my constituents believe that the AFD should remain as a condition of EDF being allowed to operate Hinkley Point C. Now, I don't claim to have the technical knowledge to know whether it is a practical option or not, and the Secretary of State has yet to make a formal decision. But it seems to me that EDF and the Environment Agency are putting together a package of mitigation measures in the hope that this deal will be signed off. I want to know why, once the decision to explore the establishment of a salt marsh was made, Pawlett Hams was designated as the preferred site. As I said earlier, the Hams is recognised as a wetland of international importance. Turning it into a salt marsh isn't a mitigation. It would be an intentional decision to cause environmental harm. It is a completely illogical choice and an extraordinary one by the Environment Agency. The view of many of my constituents is that the Environment Agency chose Pawlett Hams so they could flood the land and save money on maintaining flood defences. So I want to ask the Minister for an assurance that the government will continue to maintain all the flood defences on the River Parrett. Finally, I want to ask the government to consider whether there might be a better way of delivering environmental improvements than through the Environment Agency. It was the Environment Agency that wanted to include an AFD in the initial development consent order. Now they apparently agree it should be removed. It is they who are the prime movers behind this unwanted salt marsh, and having retreated from Pawlett Hams, now wish to inflict this on other parts of the countryside. If an acoustic fish deterrent is truly impractical, and I remain to be convinced, then I would like to see the money saved, which will be tens of millions of pounds, put at the disposal of the local community to fund genuine environmental improvements. And I want to see those decisions taken by democratically accountable bodies, such as Somerset Council and the local town and parish councils. In my view, they are more likely to spend the money wisely than the agency that thought that turning Pawlett Hams into a salt marsh was a good idea. Thank you.
This House will consider the environmental impact of the proposed salt marshes at Pawlett Hams and other sites. Tessa Mons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I recognise I have very little time in which, because I wish to make sure that the Minister has an opportunity to respond to some of the questions that both the member for Bridgewater and I will raise. I recognise I've already mentioned the fact that it was a very heavy-handed approach. That's how the constituents that I represent feel, and that there's very little detail, and this has caused enormous distress in my community in Kingston Seymour. I recognise also that, and I thank the Honourable Member for actually talking about those campaigners, many of whom I know myself. And I would recognise the efforts also of Claire Sully, who was one of his opponents in the general election. But in an effort to balance, I think I should also recognise that back in 2011, when this came to Kingston Seymour once before from the Environment Agency, Liam Fox was somebody who helped to see this off in a previous iteration. So there are a number of things I just want to mention very briefly, and that is to say that there is some expert evidence which was offered in 2011 from Dr. Rod Kirby, who's a coastal geomorphologist and a scientist, and he advised that any salt marsh would eventually wash away or be eroded. I've already mentioned to the Minister earlier today that actually this piece of coast is on the Severn Bore, that the rise and fall of the tide, and this will affect on every one of those communities that is now impacted or potentially impacted. There's the second highest tidal rise in the world, and therefore it seemed highly likely. I've been informed by local historians that actually the seawall that exists already is of Roman origin in places, and I cannot understand exactly what the Environment Agency intends. If it intends to breach the seawall, then that will increase the level of flooding. If it's intending to build up the seawall, then it's not going to create any more salt marsh. So I'm really very unsure of how this is. I think I will pick up exactly on the Honourable Member's point about why it is that we were all told that this acoustic fish deterrent thing was going to be absolutely the answer to all problems back, a wee while ago, many years ago actually, and now it appears to be utter fiction, and I don't understand how it is that we can suddenly be looking at creating salt marsh and dismissing the number of fish that were going to be killed when that was a critical factor when Hinkley Point C was being discussed, and everyone was raising their hands in horror at the fact that there was going to be massive destruction of fish, but the acoustic fish deterrent was going to get rid of that problem. The area that we're talking about, Kingston Seymour, there are concerns from the residents, and I have to say there are people, there's not 100% of the population that is against this, but people need the detail. So I would say that there was a meeting and a number of constituents have raised with me the following points. They're really concerned about solar farms, about the sewage works that are in this area, and the adverse impacts of saltwater on the 3 freshwater fishing lakes that are in Kingston Seymour. They are very concerned also about, as I said, the increased risk of flooding, and they already experienced increased insurance costs for their properties and businesses in 2011 as a result of the Environment Agency's proposals then. It's also the fact that there is a coastal footpath, and it's brilliant. It's an opportunity for people to move back and forth along the coast. And I myself, shortly after being elected on this occasion, went to the opening of the peer-to-peer coastal path, which is a multi-user path, and it connects Weston-super-Mare Pier with Clevedon Pier, and it's massively well used. Even before it was opened, a week after the election, it had been incredibly popular in that first week, and the numbers of people using it were absolutely huge. So I think the other thing that the Minister might want to know is that part of Kingston Seymour is in there are sites of special scientific interest, and it seems slightly perverse that where we have conservation sites, and we've all been working hard to protect that area, and there are a number of protected species there, and yet we're now proposing to mitigate the mitigation that everybody's provided. It's absolutely bonkers. We're going to end up mitigating the mitigation of the mitigation of the mitigation if we carry on like this. So I really don't see that it's particularly helpful. The other thing I was going to say is that I am aware that there have been there are different and expanded tourist offerings in this area since the last EA scheme got shot off in about 2012, 2013, and that there's been significant investment in the businesses, including barn conversions, which have created tourism accommodation, office and commercial activities. There are new caravan and camping grounds. There's a new golf course facilities, and several of those businesses have created all sorts of recreational amenity. So I am really concerned, and I wonder if the Minister might enable local people in Kingston Seymour to understand exactly what it is that the Environment Agency proposes and how it's going to impact them, and that needs to be done really quickly before investigations take place as to the suitability of the land. Thank you.
Indeed, Mr Twigg, and it's an honour to serve under your chairmanship. Can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Bridgewater on securing this debate and for his excellent representation of his constituents' views here today. Let me begin by saying that this is the subject of a live planning case, and I'm sure that honourable members will understand the limits on what I can say. I can, however, assure honourable members that I have listened carefully to the points raised, asked some of the questions that they have asked of my officials, and have spent quite some considerable time thinking about this. So I hope that what I am going to say will be useful to them and to their constituents. So let me begin by setting out the facts of this case. The Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2017 protects special areas of conservation and special protected areas, so SACs and SPAs. These regulations require an assessment of whether a plan or project could have an adverse impact on the integrity of a protected site. Any harm must be mitigated unless there are imperative reasons of overriding public interest and no alternative. In these cases, compensatory measures must be secured. So in this case, an acoustic fish deterrent was part of the approved mitigation for the impacts of Hinkley C on the Severn Estuary. Hinkley Point C has applied to remove the acoustic fish deterrent. This means that compensation may be needed for the loss of fish within the Severn Estuary site. And the species of concern are Atlantic cod, sea bass, whiting and herring. Now, in their pre-application consultation earlier this year, Hinkley proposed Pawlett Hams as suitable for compensatory salt marsh habitat. Pawlett Hams, as the Honourable Gentleman has already said, is designated as part of the Bridgewater Bay SSSI, and it was designated in 1989. It is particularly important for its network of freshwater ditches and their associate invertebrate communities, insects. Pawlett Hams is also part of the Severn Estuary Ramsar, which is wetland site, and SPA. SPA is a European designation for bird sites as well. So it has, if you like, a triple protection. So in their response to the pre-application consultation, the Environment Agency was unable to agree with the suitability of the Pawlett Hams sites until further evidence and assessment had been completed. So Hinkley approaches the Environment Agency. It's not, if I can just gently correct him, the Environment Agency sort of suggesting it, is my understanding. The applicant makes a request to the regulator. I understand that following the consultation, Hinkley Point C are now investigating new locations for salt marsh creation, as he said rather recently, as an alternative to Pawlett Hams, and they are holding early conversations with stakeholders ahead of public consultation, and we've heard from colleagues on that today. Any additional sites being put forward are sites identified and selected by Hinkley Point C, not the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency agrees that the marine measures proposed are an appropriate option within a wider compensation package. They have not agreed on the scale of the measures to offset the predicted adverse effects. And flood modelling, to the Honourable Lady's question, and flood risk assessments would be required for identified sites. Sure.
Thank you. Just very quickly, as I understand it, the Environment Agency is actually helping the integrity of the seawall by actually building up the seawalls at Kingston Seymour. So it seems incredibly perverse that they might agree that this should change, in that they're actually making it better, creating more flood protection for the villages in Kingston Seymour.
Minister.
Let me come on to flood protection, and I'm going to say something about salt marshes later on. And if she's not satisfied with my response by the end, I'm very happy to write to the Environment Agency and to write to her on her behalf. So, next steps, the application for a material change is currently in the pre-application stage. This will involve consultation and engagement with various bodies, including statutory consultees, so that includes Environment Agency, and Natural England, which looks after our SSSIs. These bodies will provide valuable information on the environmental impacts. This will include the sufficiency of the compensation package and its ability to compensate for the impact on protected fish species, because let's not forget this is about protecting the fish. So, to comply with the pre-application consultation requirements under the 2008 Planning Act, Hinkley Point C must carry out an appropriate consultation about any proposed changes. So the decision relating to this project will ultimately be from my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero to make. I am confident that he will do so correctly in line with the requirements of the Planning Act. But in doing so, he will need to consider all relevant issues. These include whether the proposed compensation is required, and if it is required, whether it is proportionate to the detrimental impact on fish populations of not fitting the acoustic fish deterrent. The planning guidance is clear. Ministers and officials should approach all such decisions with an open mind, based on the evidence presented to them objectively and without having or giving the appearance of having any predetermined views on the merits or otherwise of the case. And we're all seasoned politicians in planning applications, I'm sure, in this room. So I can't discuss the particular merits of this case, but I would like to raise some broader points prompted by some of the issues, because I too have questions, and I've asked some of SIP's questions. So I've heard in particular from what honourable members have asked, it has made clear that we must deliver our infrastructure goals in a way that is positive for our natural world and for our wider landscapes. If we are to meet our ambitious targets on nature restoration while accelerating to net zero, we will have to think carefully about how we use our land. That is why the forthcoming land use framework for England will consider cross-governmental issues such as energy and food security, and how we can expand nature-rich habitats such as wetlands, peat bogs and forests. So spatial planning will play an important role in the delivery of the government's growth and clean energy missions. And the land use framework will work hand in hand with the strategic spatial energy plan. The government will also explore the opportunities for spatial planning to support the delivery of other types of infrastructure. I do, of course, recognise in some cases the planning regime acts as a major brake on economic growth, which is why the government will make the changes we need to forge ahead with new grid connections, roads, railways, reservoirs and other nationally significant infrastructure. The proposed Planning and Infrastructure Bill will accelerate house building and infrastructure delivery, streamline the delivery process for critical infrastructure, including accelerating upgrades to the national grid and boosting renewable energy. This will benefit local communities, unlock delivery of our 2030 clean power mission and net zero obligations, and it will also ensure our domestic energy security. We will simplify the consenting process for major infrastructure projects and enable new and improved national policy statements to come forward. We will also establish a review process to provide the opportunity for them to be updated every 5 years, and this will give increased certainty to developers and to communities. But we are just as committed to protecting and restoring nature. And in England, we are committed to halting the decline in species abundance by 2030 and reversing it by 2042. We are also committed to reducing the risk of species extinction, and we will restore and create more than 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat by 2042. Delivering these targets sits at the heart of our mission to ensure nature's recovery. We will look to reduce pressures on species and protected sites, such as pollution and climate change, and we will take action to recover specific species. I would just like to say a quick word about solar farms, because I know there's been a lot of talk about solar farms. We heard that from the Honourable Lady for Wells and Mendip Hills. My understanding from conversations with my biodiversity net gain team is that when you put in a solar farm on grazing land, the actual biodiversity net gain is up to 140%. So I understand there are concerns about solar farms, but actually this is a really interesting way to diversify farm income whilst providing a boost to nature. I want to say something about salt marshes, because they've had a bad rap in this debate. These are incredibly valuable habitats. They are wonderfully mysterious places on the border between land and sea. They are a liminal landscape in constant change, shifting with the tides, and as such, they are often overlooked, undervalued, and as we've heard, they can be talked down. So I want to speak up for the salt marshes. They play a vital role in supporting species. For many fish, including sea bass and herring, these wetlands serve as essential nurseries.
Sitting suspended until 2:30.